The arrow was already in flight when Gisela saw it. 2 seconds. That's all she had to decide whether the alpha's 5-year-old son would live or die. The poisoned silver tip caught the moonlight as it screamed through the darkness toward little Klaus's heart. And Gisela, the omega they'd called worthless her entire life, the wolf too weak to shift properly, the girl who couldn't even hold her own in basic training. She moved faster than she'd ever moved before. Listen, if you're already hooked, do me a massive favor right now. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug. Because what you're about to hear, this story of the weakest wolf who became the pack's greatest protector, you won't want to miss a single second. Now let's continue. Her body slammed into Klaus's small frame just as the arrow would have pierced his chest. They tumbled together into the wet leaves, and the silver arrowhead tore straight through Gisela's shoulder instead. The pain was instant and absolutely excruciating. Silver burns werewolves from the inside out, liquefying organs, shutting down healing abilities, killing within minutes. But Klaus was breathing. The air was alive. And somehow, that made the fire eating through Gisela's shoulder bearable. The forest exploded into chaos around them. Warriors materialized from every shadow, forming a protective wall around the fallen child and the bleeding omega. Alpha Wilhelm's roar of terror and rage actually shook the trees, the sound of a father who'd almost lost everything. His massive gray wolf, bigger than any other in the Schattenwald Pack, crashed through the underbrush with Beta Friedrich right behind him. But Gisela's consciousness was already fading, silver poison spreading through her bloodstream like liquid death. Her last coherent thought before darkness took her wasn't about her own survival. It was about the scent she'd caught on that arrow, a scent that shouldn't exist because it belonged to a wolf the pack had executed 3 years ago. It belonged to Adalbert, the traitor who'd tried to overthrow Wilhelm, who'd poisoned 12 warriors to prove the pack was vulnerable, who'd been publicly beheaded for his crimes. Somehow, impossibly, Adalbert was alive. And he'd just declared war. When Gisela woke in the pack infirmary, her first emotion was shock. Omegas didn't survive direct silver poisoning. Their weaker healing abilities couldn't fight the toxin. He should be dead. Yet here she was, breathing, feeling the rough sheets beneath her fingers, smelling the sharp bite of wolfsbane antiseptic in the air. Her second emotion was confusion, because Alpha Wilhelm stood at the foot of her bed actually looking at her. Not through her the way alphas typically looked at omegas. Not past her like she was furniture. He was seeing her, really seeing her, maybe for the first time in her 22 years as a member of his pack. Wilhelm's voice was rough with an emotion she'd never heard from him when he told her she'd saved his son's life. The healers had never seen an omega survive such concentrated silver exposure. They couldn't explain why she was still breathing. More than that, they couldn't explain why she was healing faster than should be possible, even with their strongest medicines. Friedrich, the scarred beta who'd fought beside Wilhelm for 30 years, stood near the door with suspicion written all over his face. He made it clear what he thought, that an omega sacrificing herself for the heir was noble but ultimately pointless if they both died. That a trained warrior could have survived the hit and protected Klaus. That Gisela's survival was an anomaly that made no logical sense. And he was right. Nothing about this made sense. Gisela had always been the weakest wolf in the pack hierarchy. Born to omega parents who died when she was young, raised in the communal nursery with dozens of other orphaned cubs, she'd never shown the strength or aggression needed to climb the ranks. Her wolf was small, pale gray, almost silver, pretty to look at but utterly useless in combat. Every training master had rejected her. Every hunting party had turned her away. She'd been assigned to laundry duty, cooking, cleaning the communal houses. Necessary work but work that earned zero respect. She'd accepted her place. What else could she do? But now, lying in that infirmary bed with the alpha standing vigil over her, something fundamental had shifted in the pack's perception of her. She could feel it in the air, see it in how the other wolves looked at her with something other than dismissal or pity. Then Gisela told them what she'd smelled on the arrow. She told them about Adalbert's scent, unmistakable even through the silver poison burning through her system. And the room went silent with a kind of heavy, dreadful silence that comes when people realize a nightmare they thought was over has only just begun. Brunhild, the head healer who'd been with the pack for 60 years, went pale. She'd prepared Adalbert's body for burial herself. She'd seen the silver blade take his head. Yet now an Omega with no reason to lie was insisting the executed traitor was alive and hunting the Alpha's heir. Wilhelm and Friedrich exchanged one of those loaded glances that came from decades of fighting together, of trusting each other with lives and secrets. Because if Adalbert had somehow survived his execution, the implications were terrifying. Adalbert hadn't just committed treason. He'd tried to destroy the pack from within. He'd claimed Wilhelm was weak for maintaining alliances with neighboring packs instead of conquering them. When the council rejected his challenge for alpha position, he'd poisoned 12 warriors to prove his point about vulnerability. But Gisela saw what the others were still processing. Adalbert wasn't after Wilhelm anymore. He was after Klaus. He was trying to destroy the Alpha's bloodline. If the heir died young before producing his own heirs, the succession would become unclear. The pack would become vulnerable. Other wolves could challenge for leadership, claiming the Alpha's line was weak, cursed, unable to protect its own. Friedrich's scarred face shifted from skepticism to respect as Gisela laid out this tactical analysis. The Omega who couldn't fight had just demonstrated better strategic thinking than half the warrior council. And if Adalbert was working with other rogues, if he'd built a following during the 3 years they thought he was dead, then the pack wasn't just facing an assassination attempt. They were already at war. Wilhelm made his decision right there in the infirmary. He assigned Gisela as Klaus's personal guardian. Not as a nursemaid or a babysitter, but as his primary protector. The Omega who'd been too weak for any meaningful pack role was suddenly responsible for the most important life in Schattenwald territory. Gisela tried to protest. She couldn't fight. She had no training. She was just an Omega who'd gotten lucky. But Wilhelm shut down every objection with cold alpha authority. Luck didn't save someone from silver poisoning that should have killed them in minutes. Luck didn't let someone spot a threat that trained sentries missed. Luck didn't explain the speed that had let an untrained Omega intercept an arrow in flight. Wilhelm told her she'd been underestimated her entire life. By the pack, by the warriors, by him. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Friedrich was ordered to assign her private quarters in the Alpha residence, close to Klaus at all times. Brunhild was told to ensure full healing and start Gisela on strengthening treatments. Whatever was keeping her alive after silver exposure needed to be nurtured and enhanced. Then Wilhelm left, Friedrich following, and Gisela was alone with Brunhild's knowing stare. The old healer studied her with eyes that seemed to see past flesh and bone into something deeper, something Gisela herself didn't understand. Brunhild told her something was different about her. Something beyond the arrow, beyond the silver survival. In the months leading up to the attack, Gisela's scent had changed. Her healing patterns had altered. Her wolf had become stronger and more present. Brunhild had been treating Gisela since she was a cub. She knew every aspect of her physiology. And recently, something fundamental had shifted. Gisela wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. Because 3 months ago something had changed. She'd been collecting herbs in the deep forest. One of the few tasks Omegas could do alone since the danger was minimal near pack territory. She'd stumbled across an ancient shrine hidden in an overgrown clearing, covered in runes that predated even the oldest pack histories. The stones had been warm, humming with power that made her weak wolf wake up with shocking alertness. She'd touched the central stone. Just once. Just her fingertips brushing the carved surface. And power had poured into her like water soaking into parched earth, like coming home to a place she'd never been but had always belonged to. Since that day, everything had been changing. Her weak wolf was getting stronger. Nothing obvious. Nothing anyone would notice in an Omega who was never tested or challenged. But Gisela noticed. Her senses sharpening. Her healing accelerating. The chronic weakness that had plagued her since childhood gradually fading, replaced by energy that hummed constantly beneath her skin. She'd told no one. How could she explain finding magical rocks in the forest that made her feel different? The pack would laugh or accuse her of dark magic. There were old laws about wolves enhancing themselves through unnatural means. She could be exiled, executed. So she'd stayed silent and pretended nothing had changed. But now Brunhild was looking at her with that knowing expression, and Gisela wondered if silence had been the right choice after all. Before she could say anything, the infirmary door burst open and a small body launched itself at her bed. Klaus crashed into her with all the force a 5-year-old could muster, crying and talking so fast his words tumbled over each other. He'd been terrified when she wouldn't wake up. His father had promised she'd be okay, but he'd been so scared. She'd saved him from the bad man with the arrow, and now his papa said she was his guardian forever, which meant she could never leave him, right? She couldn't leave like his mama had. Gisela's heart broke for this child who'd never known his mother, whose Luna Helga had died bringing him into the world, who carried abandonment wounds deeper than anyone his age should bear. She wrapped her good arm around him and made a promise that settled into her bones like an unbreakable oath. She wasn't going anywhere. He was stuck with her. Klaus's tear-stained face transformed with the brightest smile she'd ever seen, and he told her she was his favorite, even better than the warriors because she actually knew how to fight when it mattered. Out of the mouths of cubs came wisdom the adults had forgotten. Strength wasn't about training yard dominance or posturing. It was about who moved when it counted, who bled when it mattered. The next 3 weeks were surreal. Gisela went from sharing a cramped room with 5 other Omegas to having private quarters in the Alpha residence, space larger than anywhere she'd ever lived, with actual furniture and a bathroom and windows overlooking the forest. It felt like playing pretend in someone else's life. But Klaus made it real. The little boy attached himself to her from dawn to dusk, talking constantly, asking endless questions, dragging her into his world with absolute trust. He showed her his favorite hiding spots, his collection of interesting rocks, his drawings of what he imagined his mother looked like based on portraits in the halls. Not everyone appreciated Gisela's elevation. The warriors especially bristled at her new position. She was breaking every unspoken rule of pack hierarchy, elevated far above her station, given authority she hadn't earned through combat prowess. She could feel their resentment every time she walked through common areas, every time she sat at the Alpha's table during pack meals. Dietrich, a senior warrior built like a mountain, made his feelings crystal clear one afternoon in the training yard. He blocked her path and made sure she understood that the Alpha's gratitude wouldn't last forever. Once Wilhelm realized she was still just a weak Omega playing protector, she'd be back in the laundry house where she belonged. The old Gisela would have lowered her eyes and fled. But something in her had died when silver entered her bloodstream, and something new had been born in its place. She told Dietrich he was right. She wasn't a warrior, couldn't match his strength or training. But she'd done what he and every other elite guard had failed to do, seen the threat and stopped it. Maybe instead of resenting her elevation, he should ask himself why an untrained Omega had been more effective than all of Wilhelm's warriors combined. Dietrich's face flushed with rage. His wolf surged forward, pressing dominance at her, trying to force her submission through sheer hierarchical weight. It was an automatic response for higher-ranked wolves. Push power until the weaker wolf backed down. Except Gisela's wolf pushed back. They both froze in shock. An Omega's wolf couldn't resist a warrior's dominance. It was genetically impossible, bred into them through generations of pack structure. Yet here she stood, holding her ground. Her wolf's presence a silver flame that refused to gutter under Dietrich's pressure. Dietrich actually stumbled backward, fear replacing contempt in his voice as he asked what she was. Gisela had no answer. She was as shocked as he was. But she wasn't about to show weakness now. She simply told him she was Klaus's guardian, and that was all he needed to know. She walked away on shaking legs, terrified he'd see through her bravado, before Friedrich's voice stopped her. The beta had been watching from the fence, had seen the entire confrontation. He acknowledged that Dietrich had been looking for an excuse to challenge her, that he was an excellent warrior but a prideful fool. Then Friedrich asked the question that changed everything. How had an Omega just resisted a senior warrior's dominance challenge? Gisela gave him the only honest answer she had. She didn't know. Friedrich studied her with those calculating eyes that had seen more battles and upheavals than she could imagine. Then he told her about old stories, legends of wolves who were more than they seemed. Omegas who carried ancient bloodlines, dormant powers that only awakened under extreme circumstances. Most packs dismissed these as myths designed to make lower-ranked wolves feel better about their station. But Friedrich had lived long enough to see impossible things. He'd learned that myths were often just forgotten history. And an Omega didn't survive silver poisoning through luck. She didn't resist warrior dominance through willpower. She didn't move fast enough to intercept an arrow unless something more was happening. Wilhelm saw Gisela as a brave Omega who got lucky. But Friedrich suspected she was something else entirely, something that hadn't been seen in the Schattenwald Pack for generations. And he intended to find out what. Starting with her training. If Gisela was going to be Klaus's guardian, she needed to actually know how to fight. Her instincts had saved the boy once. Training would ensure she could save him again. Friedrich told her to meet him in the private training yard at dawn in clothes she didn't mind destroying. The training was absolutely brutal. Friedrich showed no mercy, made no accommodations for her Omega status or inexperience. He pushed her until she collapsed, then pushed her to stand again. Combat forms, defensive maneuvers, attack patterns, weapons training. He drilled it all with relentless precision. When Gisela hesitated during a knife drill, overthinking the movements, Friedrich barked that she needed to stop using logic and let her wolf lead. She protested that her wolf was weak, that everyone had always said so. Friedrich told her everyone was wrong. He'd been watching her, really watching. Her wolf wasn't weak, she'd been suppressed. By pack expectations, by her own beliefs, by the poisonous idea that Omegas couldn't be strong. But her wolf was there, practically clawing to get out. She needed to stop holding her back. So Gisela tried. She stopped thinking and started feeling. Stopped mimicking warrior forms and started listening to how her body wanted to move. Stopped fighting her wolf and started working with her. Something remarkable happened. Her wolf began emerging in partial transformations. Not full shifts, she still couldn't manage those, but enhancements. Claws when needed. Enhanced vision in darkness. The ability to track scents with precision that shocked even Friedrich. He told her she was a natural hunter. Better than half his warriors. After she successfully tracked him through 3 miles of forest using only scent markers. He asked how it was possible for someone who'd never hunted. Gisela couldn't explain it, but she knew the answer. A shrine. Whatever power had soaked into her from those ancient stones was unlocking abilities that had always existed, just buried under layers of conditioning and learned helplessness. She started visiting the shrine in secret, usually before dawn when Klaus was sleeping and the pack was quiet. The stones still hummed with that strange power. Each visit made her wolf stronger, more present, more real. The runes carved into the stone slowly became comprehensible, like learning a language she'd always known but forgotten. They told a story of the first walkers, guardian wolves chosen by the forest itself to protect pack lands, who'd sworn oaths binding them to guardian duty for life. One night, 6 weeks after the initial attack, Gisela stood before the shrine and made her own oath. The words rose from somewhere deep inside, ancient and powerful, flowing in a language her conscious mind didn't know but her wolf understood perfectly. The stones blazed with silver light. The forest held its breath. And when the light faded, Gisela felt complete. Like scattered pieces of herself had finally locked into place. She wasn't Gisela the Omega anymore, trying to become something she wasn't. She was Gisela the Walker, fully awakened, fully empowered, ready for whatever came next. What came next was intelligence that made her blood run cold. Friedrich's scouts captured a low-level rogue from Adalbert's forces. Under careful interrogation, conducted with healers present to prevent permanent harm, the rogue revealed details that threatened everything. Adalbert wasn't just seeking revenge. He'd made contact with dark practitioners, wolves exiled from their packs for using forbidden magic, who'd turned to blood rituals and death curses in their bitterness. They'd promised him power beyond measure, strength to overthrow not just Schattenwald but all neighboring packs, establishing himself as a new kind of alpha who ruled through fear and dark magic rather than strength and wisdom. But the power required sacrifice. Specifically, the blood of an alpha's heir, spilled during a lunar eclipse. And the next eclipse was 3 weeks away. The emergency council meeting was tense. Wilhelm wanted to fortify the alpha residence, triple the guards, ensure no one could get close to Klaus without going through dozens of warriors. But Gisela saw the flaw in that thinking. That's exactly what Adalbert would expect. He'd wait until he could penetrate the defenses or find a way to draw the guards away. They needed to be smarter. She proposed using Klaus as bait. The room erupted. Wilhelm's face darkened with protective rage. Even Friedrich looked shocked. But Gisela pushed through the objections, clarifying quickly. Not really using Klaus, using a decoy. Someone his size, wearing his clothes, carrying his scent. Let Adalbert think he'd found an opening. Let him commit to the attack. When he did, every warrior in the pack would be waiting. A senior warrior demanded to know what happened if Adalbert saw through the deception and went for the real Klaus instead. Gisela answered with absolute conviction. He wouldn't. Because she'd be with the real Klaus. Hidden by guardian magic that even dark practitioners couldn't penetrate. The shrine had taught her that walkers could create sanctuaries. Protected spaces invisible to hostile magic, undetectable by any wolf with ill intent. She could hide Klaus somewhere Adalbert would never find, somewhere even dark magic couldn't reach. The council argued for hours. Wilhelm hated every aspect involving his son, even as a decoy. But eventually Friedrich convinced him this was how they'd force a confrontation on their terms, in a place of their choosing when they were ready. The planning was meticulous. Warriors positioned throughout the territory. The decoy, a young warrior named Hilda roughly Klaus's size, prepared and trained. Elaborate illusion magic from a friendly which would make her look and smell exactly like Klaus from a distance. And Gisela prepared her sanctuary. She chose a location deep in pack territory, in forest so thick and overgrown most wolves avoided it. Surrounded by ancient trees that had stood for centuries, she drew on every bit of her guardian power. She called to the forest itself, to magic that predated packs and politics. She carved protective runes into earth, mixed her blood with sacred herbs, spoke words of warding the shrine had taught her. The sanctuary bloomed into existence. Not visible to the eye but present nonetheless. A pocket of absolute safety, warded by walker magic and the forest's own protective power. Nothing with hostile intent could enter. Nothing with darkness in its heart could even perceive it. She brought Klaus there the day before the lunar eclipse. The little boy was scared but trying to be brave the way 5-year-olds do when they don't fully understand danger but no adults are worried. He asked if they were camping, looking around at the circle of ancient trees, at moss covering the ground like natural carpet. Gisela told him it was a special kind of camping, a secret hideout only they knew about. The best part. No one could find them unless they wanted to be found. Not even if they searched really hard. Klaus asked if that meant even his papa couldn't find them. Not even papa, Gisela confirmed, though they'd tell him afterward so he wouldn't worry. Klaus seemed to accept this, settling against her side with a complete trust that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Then he asked if she was scared. Gisela considered lying but Klaus deserved honesty. He'd survive more than most adults before his 6th birthday. Treating him like he couldn't handle truth would be insulting. She told him yes, she was scared. But being scared didn't mean they couldn't be brave. Being scared just meant they cared about what happened. And she cared deeply about keeping him safe. Klaus asked if it was because she was his guardian. Gisela corrected him gently. It was because he was her Klaus. He smiled at that, tension easing from his small shoulders. They spent the rest of the day in the sanctuary, playing quiet games, telling stories, eating the food she'd packed. As night fell and the moon began to rise, full and perfect, ready for eclipse. Klaus drifted to sleep against her shoulder. Gisela stayed awake, every sense extended, monitoring the forest beyond their protective bubble. She could feel pack warriors taking positions. Could sense Friedrich's steady presence coordinating the defense. Could taste Wilhelm's barely controlled rage and fear on the wind. Then, as Earth's shadow began creeping across the moon's face, she felt it. Adalbert. His corrupted presence was like a wound in the forest's fabric, wrong and rotting and powerful. He'd taken the bait. Through her enhanced senses, Gisela tracked the confrontation. Adalbert and his rogues descended on the decoy with overwhelming force, confident in their dark magic, certain of victory. The pack warriors sprung their trap, surrounding the rogues, cutting off escape routes, engaging in the kind of coordinated assault that decades of training made possible. The battle was brief and brutal. Adalbert was powerful, enhanced by blood magic and hatred, but he faced an entire pack of trained warriors who'd been preparing for this moment. Friedrich himself engaged the corrupted wolf, their clash shaking trees, their power sending shockwaves through the forest. But even as warriors pressed their advantage, Gisela felt something else. A splinter of Adalbert's consciousness, a piece of his dark magic, searching desperately to locate the real Klaus before his physical form was destroyed. The magic slithered through the forest like a serpent, testing boundaries, seeking gaps in defenses. It passed within feet of the sanctuary, close enough that Gisela could feel its cold, oily presence. But the Wachter wards held. The sanctuary remained invisible, impenetrable, safe. Adalbert's searching magic grew frantic, desperate. He knew he was losing the physical battle. His rogues were falling. His corrupted form taking damage, even dark magic couldn't heal quickly enough. He needed Klaus now, needed the heir's blood for his ritual before it was too late. But he couldn't find him. The guardian had hidden the child too well. Gisela felt the exact moment Adalbert realized he'd lost. Felt his rage and despair and hatred coalesce into one final, desperate act. If he couldn't complete his ritual, couldn't claim his victory, he'd ensure the pack remembered this night forever. The corrupted wolf detonated. Not a physical explosion, magical. A release of all the dark power he'd accumulated. All the blood magic and death curses and forbidden rituals, unleashed in one catastrophic wave. Warriors were thrown back. Trees scorched. The very earth cracked under the strain of that much concentrated malevolence. But the sanctuaries held. Gisela's wards, placed throughout the forest wherever children might be hiding, absorbed the blast's worst effects. Protected the vulnerable. Saved lives. When the dark magic finally dissipated, Adalbert was gone. Truly gone this time. Not executed or banished but annihilated by his own desperate gambit. His rogues had been scattered or captured. The threat, at least for now, had ended. Gisela cautiously lowered the sanctuary wards, emerging with Klaus still asleep in her arms. The forest was devastated. Scorched earth, fallen trees, the smell of dark magic lingering like poison. But it was over. Wilhelm found her first. His alpha wolf magnificent despite battle damage. His eyes scanning frantically until they landed on his sleeping son. The relief on his face was profound. He told her she'd kept Klaus safe. Through everything, through Adalbert's final curse, she'd kept him safe. Gisela replied simply, "That's what guardians do." The pack's victory celebration was muted by losses sustained. 3 warriors dead in battle. Another dozen seriously injured. The forest itself would take years to recover from dark magic's corruption. But Klaus lived. The heir was safe. The pack had survived. In the weeks that followed, Gisela's role became formalized in ways that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Wilhelm created a new position, guardian of the pack, and appointed her officially. Not Omega, not warrior, but something distinct and equally valuable. Her responsibility was protecting all pack children, maintaining sanctuary wards, training other wolves in guardian techniques. Other packs heard the story of the Omega who wasn't, the Wachter who'd saved an alpha's heir, who'd stood against dark magic and won. Delegations arrived from Nordwald and other allied territories, seeking to learn about guardian magic, asking if Gisela could train their wolves in protective techniques. She became what she'd always been meant to be: a protector, a teacher, a living reminder that strength came in many forms and hierarchies were less important than purpose. Klaus grew up with the best possible guardian, learning not just how to be strong but how to be kind, how to protect those weaker than himself, how to value every pack member regardless of rank. By the time he was 10, he'd tell anyone who asked that the strongest wolf he knew wasn't his father the Alpha or Friedrich the Beta. It was Gisela, the guardian who'd saved his life twice before he could even remember. Friedrich continued training with Gisela, though their relationship evolved into partnership rather than teacher and student. Together they developed a new fighting style combining traditional warrior aggression with guardian defense, creating something more effective than either approach alone. Brunhild eventually told Gisela the full story of the shrine, how it had been created centuries ago by the first Wachters, how it served as a beacon for guardian wolves who'd lost their way, how it would remain in the forest as long as packs needed protecting. She also revealed she had some guardian blood herself, though not enough to be a true Wachter, just enough to recognize one when she saw them. And Dietrich, the warrior who'd challenged Gisela so dismissively in the training yard, became one of her staunchest supporters. He told everyone who'd listen about the day an Omega resisted his dominance, how that impossibility forced him to question everything he thought he knew about strength and weakness, how the pack was better for having Gisela in a position of power. But perhaps the most significant change was in Gisela herself. She'd spent 22 years believing she was weak, believing the pack's assessment of her value, believing her inability to fight like a warrior meant she had no worth. The shrine had woken her power, yes, but more importantly it had forced her to see herself clearly, to recognize she'd never been weak, only different. Only exactly what she was supposed to be. 5 years after that first arrow, Gisela stood in the training yard watching young wolves practice guardian techniques. Klaus was among them, now 10 years old, laughing as he worked with younger cubs, showing them how to create small protective barriers. Wilhelm joined her, standing silently before speaking quietly. He told her he'd never properly thanked her. Not for what she'd given the pack. Gisela replied that he'd given her purpose. She should be thanking him. Wilhelm shook his head firmly. He'd given her a title. She'd already had the purpose all along. He'd just finally recognized it. But what she'd given them had changed the entire pack. Changed how they thought about strength, about value, about what made someone worth following. Half the young warriors now trained in guardian techniques alongside traditional combat. Parents sought her advice more often than council elders. She'd shown them that protecting was just as important as fighting. Maybe more important. Gisela watched Klaus help a tiny female cub create her first protective ward, saw the concentration on both faces, the patience and care in Klaus's instruction. This was the future she'd helped build. A pack that valued guardians as much as warriors, protection as much as aggression, care as much as conquest. Wilhelm continued, saying that when Klaus was old enough to take over as Alpha, when Wilhelm finally retired, the young heir would need a strong council. And Wilhelm couldn't think of anyone he'd rather have advising Klaus than Gisela. Would she consider being his second when the time came? Being an Alpha's second wasn't quite Beta. That position was reserved for the strongest warrior, but it was close. It would make her one of the most powerful wolves in the pack, with authority transcending traditional hierarchy. Gisela said carefully that Klaus should choose his own second when the time came, based on who he trusted and needed. Wilhelm told her with certainty that Klaus would choose her. He'd watched his son grow up with Gisela as his model for strength. When Klaus thought about good leadership, he thought about protection and care and seeing threats before they arrived. He thought about her. So Wilhelm was asking now, would she serve his son as second when that day came? Gisela looked back at the training yard, at Klaus and the other children, at the future she'd fought so hard to protect. She said yes, she would, because that was what guardians did. They protected. They served. They stood between the vulnerable and the darkness. Always, without question, without hesitation. It was what she'd been born to do. What she'd finally learned to become. The Omega they called weak had saved the Alpha's heir. But more than that, she'd saved herself. From a lifetime believing she was worthless, from the crushing weight of pack expectations, from the lie that strength only came in one form. She was Gisela. She was Wachter. She was exactly enough. And years later, when historians wrote about the Schattenwald Pack's golden age, when they chronicled the reign of Alpha Klaus the Wise, they would always begin the same way. It started with a guardian. A wolf who'd been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed as weak. A wolf who proved that the strongest warriors aren't always the ones who fight. Sometimes they're the ones who protect. Sometimes, strength is knowing when to move, when to sacrifice, when to stand between the darkness and the ones you love, no matter the cost. Her name was Gisela, and she changed everything. The pack stopped measuring worth by dominance and started measuring it by contribution. They stopped dismissing Omegas as worthless and started recognizing that every wolf had gifts, had purpose, had strength in their own way. They stopped believing hierarchy was destiny and started believing every wolf could rise to meet their potential. All because one Omega refused to accept that weak was all she'd ever be. All because when that arrow flew through the darkness, Gisela chose to move. And in moving, in bleeding, in surviving what should have killed her, she proved something the pack had forgotten, that the heart of a guardian beats stronger than the claws of 100 warriors. That love and loyalty and the fierce determination to protect can move mountains, can change destinies, can transform not just one wolf but an entire pack's understanding of what strength truly means. Klaus would grow up to be the greatest alpha the Schattenwald Pack had ever known, not because he was the strongest fighter or the most dominant wolf, but because he learned from Gisela that true power comes from lifting others up. From protecting the vulnerable. From seeing worth in every pack member regardless of their rank or their history or their perceived weaknesses. He would tell his own children years later about the day a weak Omega threw herself in front of a silver arrow meant for his heart. About how she survived the unsurvivable. About how she stood against a corrupted wolf and dark magic, and won not through violence but through an older, deeper power. The power of a guardian who would rather die than let harm come to those she loved. He would tell them that Gisela was the bravest wolf he'd ever known. The strongest. The most important. And he would teach them what she taught him. That strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about what you're willing to stand in front of. Who you're willing to bleed for. What you're willing to sacrifice to keep the people you love safe. That's what guardians know that warriors sometimes forget. That's what Gisela proved when everyone said she was too weak to matter. That's the truth that changed an entire pack and created a legacy that would echo through generations. But the story doesn't end with victory and triumph. Because life in a werewolf pack is never that simple. And Gisela's journey as a guardian was only beginning. The year after Adalbert's defeat brought new challenges. Word spread through the supernatural community about the Schattenwald Pack's guardian, about the Omega who'd awakened ancient Wachter bloodlines, about the wolf who could create sanctuaries impervious to dark magic. And not all the attention was positive. Other packs grew nervous. If Schattenwald had guardians, what did that mean for the traditional hierarchy? What happened when Omegas across all territories started questioning whether they were truly weak or just suppressed? The implications threatened the entire social structure that kept wolf packs stable, predictable, and controllable. Some alphas saw Gisela as an inspiration. They reached out to Wilhelm, asking for guardian training for their own packs, recognizing the value of wolves who could protect rather than just fight. These alliances strengthened Schattenwald's position, created networks of cooperation that hadn't existed before. But others saw her as a threat, a disruption to natural order, an anomaly that needed to be corrected before it spread like wildfire through Omega populations everywhere. The first assassination attempt came on a misty autumn morning when Gisela was training a group of young wolves in the forest. The attacker was professional, hired from outside pack territories. A lone wolf mercenary with no allegiance to anyone but his employer. He used silver bullets, knowing Gisela's reputation for surviving silver exposure, counting on overwhelming force where poison had failed before. But he hadn't counted on Klaus. The boy was 11 now, trained by both Gisela and Friedrich, carrying both guardian instincts and warrior skills. He sensed the threat seconds before the first shot, shouted a warning that saved Gisela's life, then threw himself into the fight with a ferocity that shocked even his father when he heard about it later. The mercenary escaped, wounded and beaten, but the message was clear. Someone wanted Gisela dead badly enough to hire outside the pack system. Someone feared what she represented enough to break the unwritten rules about pack sovereignty and territorial respect. Wilhelm increased security, but Gisela knew that wouldn't solve the underlying problem. As long as she existed as proof that Omegas could be powerful, could be important, could change pack hierarchy from the bottom up, she'd be a target. Not just for rogues seeking revenge but for those invested in maintaining the status quo. She could have hidden, could have retreated to the Alpha residence, surrounded herself with warriors, let others protect her the way she protected them. But that would have betrayed everything she'd learned, everything she'd become. Guardians didn't hide behind others. They stood in front. So instead, Gisela did something that terrified Wilhelm and thrilled Friedrich. She started traveling to other packs, offering guardian training to any wolf who showed the aptitude, regardless of their rank. She visited Nordwald, where Alpha Constantine welcomed her with open arms, eager to develop guardian capabilities in his own territory. She went to Ostwald, where a young Omega named Liesel showed remarkable guardian potential and begged for training. Each trip was dangerous. Each journey took her outside Schattenwald's protected territory, made her vulnerable to attack, put her in situations where even her Walker abilities might not be enough. But with every pack she visited, with every Omega she trained, with every Alpha she convinced that guardians enhanced rather than threatened pack strength, she was building something bigger than herself. She was starting a movement. Liesel from Ostwald became the second confirmed Walker to awaken in living memory. The young Omega had been even more suppressed than Gisela, barely able to shift at all, considered worthless even by Omega standards. But under Gisela's training, with techniques learned from the ancient shrine, Liesel's guardian abilities exploded into being with a power that shocked her entire pack. Within 6 months, Liesel had saved her Alpha's twin daughters from a fire that should have killed them, creating a protective barrier that held back flames and smoke long enough for warriors to reach them. Her pack's perspective shifted overnight, just as Schattenwald's had, just as Gisela knew it would. Then came Margarethi from Sudwald, who awakened guardian abilities at age 43 after spending her entire adult life believing she was too weak to matter. And Brunhild from Westwald, no relation to Gisela's healer mentor, but carrying the same fierce determination. And Werner, proving that males could be guardians too, that Walker bloodlines weren't gender-specific, that the old stories had gotten so much wrong about what guardians were and could be. Within 3 years of Adalbert's defeat, there were 12 confirmed Walkers across 6 different packs. 12 wolves who'd been dismissed as weak, who'd been underestimated and undervalued, who now stood as proof that the traditional hierarchy was built on lies and assumptions rather than truth. The backlash was inevitable. A coalition of conservative alphas, led by Alpha Sigmund from a distant mountain pack, declared the Guardian movement a threat to pack stability. They claimed Gisela was using dark magic to artificially enhance weak wolves, that the Walker bloodlines were a myth she'd invented to gain power, that allowing Omegas to believe they could be strong would lead to chaos and the collapse of pack society. Sigmund challenged Wilhelm directly, demanding he exile Gisela and forbid Guardian training throughout Schattenwald territory. When Wilhelm refused, Sigmund called for a conclave, a gathering of alphas from across the region to vote on whether the Guardian movement should be suppressed by force. The conclave was held on neutral ground, in a massive clearing that had served as meeting space for inter-pack negotiations for centuries. 23 alphas attended, representing territories from the coast to the mountains, bringing their betas and senior warriors, creating a gathering of concentrated power that made the very air feel heavy with dominance. Gisela attended too. Not as Wilhelm's Omega, not even as his guardian, but as herself. As the wolf who'd started this movement, who'd proven guardians were real, who'd trained the other Walkers now standing strong in their own packs. She was terrified. She'd never faced this many alphas, this much concentrated authority, this level of scrutiny. Every instinct screamed at her to lower her eyes, submit to their collective power, become small and invisible the way Omegas were trained to do in the presence of Alphas. But she stood tall, met their gazes, spoke when they demanded answers. Sigmund made his case with practiced rhetoric and appeals to tradition. He painted Guardians as a threat to natural order, claimed Gisela was manipulating vulnerable Omegas with false promises, argued that pack stability depended on maintaining clear hierarchies where everyone knew their place. Several Alphas nodded in agreement. The conservative faction was larger than Gisela had hoped, more organized, more committed to suppressing the Guardian movement before it spread further. Then Wilhelm spoke. He didn't defend Gisela with emotional appeals or personal loyalty. Instead, he presented facts. Casualty rates in Schattenwald had dropped by 40% since Guardians started actively protecting pack members. Inter-pack conflicts had decreased because Guardians could de-escalate situations before they turned violent. Pack morale had improved as wolves previously considered worthless found purpose and value. Most importantly, Klaus was alive. The heir to Schattenwald had survived multiple assassination attempts because a Guardian had protected him when warriors failed. That wasn't theory or philosophy. It was measurable, undeniable reality. Other pro-Guardian Alphas spoke up. Constantine from Nordwald talked about how his pack's Guardian had prevented a coup attempt by sensing the conspirators' hostile intent before they could act. Alpha Helena from a coastal pack described how her Guardian had saved an entire generation of pups from a tsunami by creating sanctuary wards that held back the water. The tide slowly shifted. Not completely. Sigmund and his faction remained opposed, but enough Alphas saw the practical value of Guardians that they couldn't justify suppressing the movement entirely. The compromise reached was that Guardian training would be permitted but regulated. Each pack could develop Guardian capabilities if their Alpha approved. No wolf could be forced into Guardian training, and no Omega could be punished for choosing not to pursue that path. The movement would continue, but within boundaries that conservative Alphas found acceptable. It wasn't everything Gisela had hoped for, but it was enough. Guardians were officially recognized. The Wachter bloodlines were acknowledged as real. And Omegas across multiple packs now had proof that weak wasn't a permanent condition but a choice to stop trying. The journey back to Schattenwald took 3 days through dense forest and mountain passes. Gisela traveled with Wilhelm, Friedrich, and a dozen warriors, but she felt lighter than she had in months. The political battle was over. The Guardians had won recognition. The movement would continue. Klaus met them at the territory border, unable to wait for their return to the Alpha residence. At 11, he was already tall for his age, showing hints of the powerful Alpha he'd become. But when he saw Gisela, he reverted to the 5-year-old who'd clung to her after the arrow, running to embrace her with relief so profound it made her eyes sting. He'd been terrified she wouldn't come back, that the conclave would vote to exile her, that he'd lose his Guardian, that the person who'd protected him and taught him and loved him would be taken away. Gisela held him tight and made the same promise she'd made 6 years earlier. She wasn't going anywhere. He was stuck with her. But privately, talking with Wilhelm late that night while Klaus slept safely in his room, she expressed concerns about the future. Recognition was wonderful, but it also made Guardians more visible targets. Sigmund hadn't accepted defeat. He'd simply lost a political battle. Wolves like him, invested in maintaining traditional hierarchy at any cost, wouldn't stop trying to eliminate what they saw as a threat. Wilhelm acknowledged the danger but pointed out what Gisela sometimes forgot. She wasn't alone anymore. She'd built a network of Guardians across multiple packs, created alliances with progressive Alphas, trained wolves who would carry on the movement if anything happened to her. The Guardian philosophy was bigger than any single wolf now, even her. And besides, Wilhelm added with a slight smile, she'd proven remarkably hard to kill. Sigmund might try, but Gisela had survived silver poisoning, dark magic, assassination attempts, and a conclave of hostile Alphas. She was quite possibly the most dangerous Omega alive. Dangerous not because she could fight, but because she could change minds, inspire loyalty, and make wolves believe in possibilities they'd never imagined. The years that followed were both peaceful and productive. Gisela continued training guardians, refining techniques, discovering new applications for walker abilities. She learned that guardians could sense emotional states, making them exceptional diplomats and mediators. They could detect lies, making them valuable advisors. They could create bonds of trust that transcended pack boundaries, making them natural ambassadors. Klaus grew into a remarkable young alpha, officially taking over from Wilhelm when he turned 21. His first act as Alpha of Schattenwald was appointing Gisela as his second, fulfilling the promise Wilhelm had made years earlier. The pack accepted it without protest. By then, no one questioned Gisela's worth or authority. Friedrich retired to an advisory role, content to let the next generation lead, proud of everything he'd helped build. Brunhild trained a successor and spent her final years documenting everything she knew about guardian magic, creating texts that would preserve walker knowledge for future generations. And the guardian movement continued expanding. Within a decade, nearly every pack had at least one active walker. Within 2 decades, guardian training was considered as essential as warrior training. The old hierarchy didn't disappear, but it became more flexible, more nuanced, with room for wolves to find their own path rather than being locked into roles determined at birth. Gisela watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. She'd never wanted to be famous or powerful. She just wanted to protect Klaus, to keep one child safe. But in doing that, in refusing to accept that weak was all she could ever be, she'd accidentally changed the entire werewolf world. The ancient shrine remained her sanctuary, the place she visited when she needed to remember who she was and where she'd come from. The stones still hummed with power, still welcomed her like coming home. And sometimes, late at night when the moon was full and the forest was quiet, she could almost hear the voices of the first walkers whispering their approval. They'd waited centuries for their bloodline to awaken again. They'd watched as packs forgot about guardians, as hierarchies became rigid, as omegas were dismissed and devalued. But they'd known, somehow, that eventually the right wolf would find the shrine, would touch the stones, would remember what had been forgotten. That wolf had been Gisela. And through her, through the movement she'd started and the guardians she'd trained and the minds she'd changed, the walker bloodlines had returned to protect a new generation, to stand between the vulnerable and the darkness, to prove that strength came in many forms and the weakest-seeming wolf could be the strongest of all. Years later, when Gisela was old and gray, when Klaus had children of his own who called her grandmother though she'd never birthed pups, when the guardian movement had become so established that young wolves couldn't imagine a time before walkers, she returned to that training yard where Dietrich had once challenged her. The space looked different now. Part of it was still dedicated to warrior training, but a larger section had been converted to guardian practices. Young wolves worked on creating protective wards, on sensing threats, on developing the intuition that made guardians so effective. They ranged from dominant alphas to submissive omegas, proving that guardian abilities transcended traditional hierarchy. One of them, a small female omega who reminded Gisela achingly of herself at that age, approached nervously. She'd heard the stories about the first walker, about the omega who'd saved an alpha's heir and changed everything. She wanted to know if the stories were true, if a weak wolf really could become strong. Gisela looked at this young omega, saw her uncertainty and hope, saw the potential waiting to be awakened. She thought about the arrow flying through darkness, about silver burning through her shoulder, about the moment she'd chosen to move instead of freeze. She told the young omega that the stories were true, but they'd gotten one critical detail wrong. She hadn't become strong. She'd always been strong. She just needed someone to help her remember. The shrine had awakened her power, yes. The training had developed her skills, absolutely. But the strength that made her throw herself in front of that arrow, the courage that made her stand up to Dietrich, the determination that built an entire movement, that had always been there, buried under years of being told she was worthless. Every wolf had that strength inside them, Gisela told the young omega. Every single one. It just took the right circumstances, the right challenge, the right moment of desperate need to bring it to the surface. The Omega asked how to find that strength, how to awaken it, how to become the wolf she was meant to be. Gisela smiled, the expression carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. She told the young wolf to start by stopping. Stop believing what others said about her limitations. Stop accepting that weak was permanent. Stop waiting for permission to become something more. And then move. When the moment came, when someone needed protection, when danger threatened those she loved, move. Don't think. Don't hesitate. Don't let fear or doubt or the crushing weight of everyone's expectations hold her back. Just move. That's what guardians did. That's what walkers had always done. Back to the very first wolves who'd sworn oaths to protect their packs. They moved when others froze. They stood when others fell. They believed in the wolves they protected even when those wolves couldn't believe in themselves. The young Omega listened with shining eyes, absorbing every word, and Gisela saw her own past reflected back at her. This was how the movement continued, how guardian philosophy spread, how the next generation learned that strength came in infinite varieties and every wolf had value beyond what traditional hierarchy assigned them. This was the legacy she'd built. Not through violence or dominance or forcing others to submit, but through protection, through teaching, through showing rather than telling what guardians could be and do. Klaus found her there in the training yard, now Alpha of Schattenwald for 15 years, still seeking her counsel on difficult decisions, still calling her his guardian though she was too old now to fight off attackers. He brought his oldest daughter with him, a bright-eyed girl of 7 who'd already started showing guardian aptitude. The little girl asked Gisela if the story was true. The one about the arrow and the silver and the weak Omega who saved her grandfather's life. Gisela knelt down to the child's level, ignoring her creaking joints, and spoke with absolute sincerity. She told the girl that yes, the story was true, every word. But the most important part wasn't about her being weak. It was about her choosing to move when it mattered. Anyone could be brave when they were strong. The real test was being brave when you had every reason to be afraid, when everyone expected you to fail, when logic said you couldn't possibly succeed. That's when you discovered what you were really made of. That's when you learned that weak and strong were just words, but courage and love and the fierce determination to protect, those were eternal truths that transcended any hierarchy, any rank, any label others tried to put on you. The little girl absorbed this with the seriousness children show when learning lessons they know are important, even if they don't fully understand why yet. Then she asked if Gisela would teach her to be a guardian when she was old enough. Gisela promised she would. And in making that promise, she felt the circle completing. From the Omega who'd been too weak to matter, to the guardian who'd changed an entire culture, to the elder who'd pass her knowledge to the next generation. This was what legacy meant. Not monuments or titles or recognition, but knowledge transferred, wisdom shared, young wolves taught to believe in themselves the way Gisela had learned to believe in herself. The sun was setting over Schattenwald territory, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber, when Gisela finally left the training yard. Klaus walked beside her, his daughter skipping ahead, and they talked about pack business and family matters and the comfortable, ordinary things that made up daily life. But Gisela's mind kept drifting back to that moment 6 years earlier. No, wait, it had been decades now, time flowing faster as she aged, when a single arrow had changed everything. She wondered sometimes what would have happened if she'd frozen instead of moved. If she'd let instinct and training and years of conditioning keep her in place while Klaus died. The pack would have survived, probably. Wilhelm would have grieved and eventually had another heir. Life would have continued. But she would have remained the weak Omega forever. Would have lived her entire life believing she had no value, no purpose, no strength worth recognizing. Would have died never knowing what she could have been, what she was always meant to become. The arrow had been a gift in a way. A horrible, terrifying gift that had forced her to choose in an instant who she wanted to be. And in choosing to move, to sacrifice, to bleed, she'd discovered her truth. She wasn't weak. She'd never been weak. She was Gisela. She was Wachter. She was a guardian who'd protected an heir, trained a movement, and changed the entire werewolf world by refusing to accept the limitations others had placed on her. And as the sun set over the forest that had witnessed her transformation, as Klaus talked about tomorrow's council meeting and his daughter chattered about her training, as the familiar paths of Schattenwald territory stretched out around them, Gisela felt something she'd spent most of her life believing she'd never experience. She felt complete, fulfilled, exactly where she was meant to be, exactly who she was meant to be, with no doubts or regrets or wishes for a different life. She'd been called weak, but she'd proven them wrong. Not through violence or dominance or forcing anyone to acknowledge her worth, but simply by being herself, by protecting when others fought, by caring when others calculated, by standing between danger and those she loved no matter what it cost her. That was the Guardian way. That was the Wachter truth. And it would echo through generations long after Gisela was gone, carried forward by every Omega who refused to believe weak was permanent, by every wolf who chose protection over aggression, by every guardian who stood their ground when darkness came. They called her weak. Until she saved the Alpha's heir from a rogue seeking revenge. Until she survived silver poisoning that should have killed her. Until she awakened ancient bloodlines and started a movement that changed pack culture forever. They called her weak. But they were wrong. And in the end, that made all the difference. This story reminds us that strength isn't always loud. It isn't always obvious. Sometimes the strongest among us are the ones everyone overlooks, the ones dismissed as too weak to matter, the ones who surprise everyone by moving when it counts. If this story resonated with you, if you felt Gisela's journey from worthless Omega to legendary Guardian, then please, subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and most importantly, drop a comment telling me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug. You're part of this community, part of this journey, and that means everything. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated can be a gift, that labels don't define you, and that the weakest seeming person might just be the strongest of all. Until next time, stay brave, stay strong, and remember, you might be a guardian waiting to wake up. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise.